Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at Elizabeth's religious settlement of 1559. Now this is a really important part of the story of Elizabeth's reign and an area where there's a lot of historical debate, because on one hand Elizabeth would say that her religious settlement of 1559 was final, and this was absolutely the church as it was going to be. But there are others who argue that there was pressure on Elizabeth from Protestant elements to move her settlement, and that indeed she did move her settlement through her reign. So there are arguments about it. There was also a great deal of controversy at the time with various different groups who opposed it or disliked it, or elements of it. I'm going to look at five kind of key questions in regard to Elizabeth's settlement. So I'm going to look at what it was. I'm going to look at what Elizabeth's own personal religious views were, and again, there's a lot of debate and kind of interest in that as a question. We're going to look at the factors Elizabeth needed to consider whilst making her religious settlement. We're going to look at the options that were open to her, and we're going to ask this question: what did Elizabeth change and keep the same as part of her religious settlement? Because there's been a huge amount of kind of upheaval in the church in the period before Elizabeth, because you've had the Great Matter under her father Henry VIII and the split with Rome, and then you've had the really quite radical Protestantism of Edward, followed by the Catholicism of Mary and the burning of the Protestants and all of that. So the church has very much been in flux. So what, if anything, can Elizabeth salvage for what there already was, and what new stuff did she need to bring in? So first of all, the question: what is the Elizabethan religious settlement? Well, this is the name given to the religious changes made for England during the reign of Elizabeth I, and it's made up of three key elements: the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity, and these are the bits that are mainly focused on the actions of 1559, and then on top of these and building around these are the royal injunctions, which gave more detailed instructions to the church about how things should be done. So moving on to the next questions, what were Elizabeth's own religious beliefs? And as I've said, this is a highly controversial issue and really intriguing and interesting one. And one of the reasons why there's so much discussion and debate about it is there isn't a complete understanding of Elizabeth's own religious views. She never makes an absolutely clear statement kind of detailing her own religious beliefs. Having said that, we know she was raised Protestant. We know the Boleyn faction, of obviously which she comes from her mother, was interested in the teaching of Martin Luther. We know that Elizabeth was educated by Sir Roger Ascham, who himself was educated on the ideas of Luther. Matthew Parker was the Boleyn chaplain, and left with the kind of the job of the spiritual welfare of Elizabeth after Anne Boleyn's execution. And Parker then goes on to be Elizabeth's first Archbishop of Canterbury. So there's this line through to the Protestantism of the Boleyn faction, and obviously we can then go back and look back at the reign of Henry VIII and how it was Anne Boleyn and the supporters around her who pushed Henry away from Catholicism, away from the Catholic Church. So with that Parker as that connection, then that gives us a hint that maybe that's where Elizabeth's ideas are as well. Clearly, she was religiously very different from her sister, and although she promised to her sister that she would maintain Catholicism, that is quite clearly a promise that Elizabeth doesn't keep. She does seem to have been religiously much closer to her brother Edward, but maybe some of that kind of radicalism that we see in Edward is maybe lacking in Elizabeth, though that again is historically debated. There are aspects of the Catholic Church that Elizabeth seemed to like. She seemed to like the singing. She definitely wanted her priest unmarried, or preferred her priest unmarried. She accepted married priests, but was known particularly with her bishops and archbishops to make comments about the fact they had wives and about their wives. She wanted to see some bit of colour, and a bit notably in the vestments that the clergy wore and other aspects of the church. And there were aspects of Protestant church services that she disliked as well, notably the long sermons. And one of the things I really like about Elizabeth is that she was known to heckle members of the clergy if they went into long rambling preaching sermons. So there are aspects of this where we can kind of go, well, she's not an absolutely pure Protestant in the way that the kind of the ideas of sides are developing in Europe. She's different, I believe, to a lot of the Protestants who've been in exile in Europe during the reign of Mary and had come back. And there seems to therefore be this bit of a gap where she is more moderate. Now, whether she's more moderate or not just because she was more moderate and that was her beliefs, whether she's more moderate because she has to think about the political implications rather than just the religious ones, and therefore we have a tempering of a Protestantism by political concerns. Again, it's not 100% sure. I mean, personally, I think she's naturally quite a moderate Protestant. I think there were aspects of the old style church that she liked and wanted to maintain, and actually probably more so than she did it to some degree, where she had to go along with some of the Protestant reforms. Notably, she needed high up clergy, and a lot of them were married, and therefore she had to accept that. So what did Elizabeth need to take into consideration while making her religious changes? Well, there's a whole range of things you need to consider, and I'm going to pick out these key three. The first of all, certainty. English society, as I've mentioned already, had been through an awful lot of uncertainty in relation to religion and rulers and all kind of different things, and we talk about the mid-Tudor crisis, don't we? And so there'd been a whole series of rebellions. Now, Elizabeth is again potentially fairly fragile hold on power right at the beginning of her reign, is not going to want to stir up more rebellions like the rebellions like her brother and her sister had seen. Foreign relations is very important. Elizabeth was at war with France when she became queen, kind of handed down from Mary. France was allied with Scotland. Philip II of Spain had just been married to her sister, the first kind of suitor for Elizabeth's hand, and obviously he's Catholic, so Elizabeth has to be careful with the degree of Protestantism she's going to go for. It again might lean her towards going back towards Catholicism because it's going to help in foreign relations. And she has to consider Parliament, because she's going to make religious changes. This is going to have to be passed by Parliament. We see the precedent set for that with the 7-year Parliament under Henry VIII. And there were plenty of Catholics in the Parliament, in particular the Marian bishops in the House of Lords. So Marian, by this we mean these are bishops appointed by Mary. So you've got Catholic bishops. They're really kind of strong force within the House of Lords. So this is again things that Elizabeth has to consider. So what are her options? And again, we kind of go, well, we've got a whole range of them. I try to break them down into 4, and you'll see really probably 1 and 4 are probably immediately going to be ones that you can't do, and so probably your choice really is in between 2 and 3. So 1 is maintain Catholicism. Well, you could do it, preserve alliance with Catholic Spain. Now the reason why that probably doesn't work, I mean, in kind of logistically, strategically, it's probably the easiest and best one. However, Elizabeth is Protestant, and so she can't abandon her Protestantism. She can't abandon her Protestant supporters who have been alongside her through her sister's reign. So 1, maintaining Catholicism, I don't really think was a particular option for Elizabeth, but it's definitely one that she might well have considered. The next one is to have Catholicism without a pope. So this is essentially going back to the church of her father, and I think there is there's a lot of merit in this as a potential line for her, that she definitely seems to like some Catholic practices. I think the difference between her and her father is that fundamentally in terms of belief, I believe Henry VIII was Catholic, and fundamentally in terms of belief I think Elizabeth is Protestant. So Catholicism without a pope, I mean, again, that would probably help with foreign relations, but again it's going to be a difficult one for Elizabeth to pursue. Option 3, and this is predominantly seen as the one that she does go for, is a moderately Protestant church, which again is a fairly politically sound option, both home and abroad, and fits most closely with Elizabeth's belief. And then 4 is a radically Protestant church. Now, that would remove all aspects of Catholicism. It would make Elizabeth's Protestant supporters very happy, but it would create a great deal of instability in the country. It would remove rituals that are valued by community. It would remove the power of bishops, which would have kind of political implications as well. It would alienate the likes of Philip of Spain and put England under real risk. I also don't think Elizabeth was a radical Protestant, but again, that's just my view, and others would disagree. And there were definitely people who were pushing for a radical church who were close to Elizabeth, the likes of Dudley, Walsingham later on, Cecil as well. So there is a push for this, and again, there's the famous ideas of a push from within the House of Commons later in her reign, pushing for a more radically Protestant church. But this is something I don't think was maybe at the front of Elizabeth's thoughts in 1559. So we're going to have a look at the kind of the key elements of the religious settlements. The first is the Act of Supremacy. So this re-established the English monarch as head of the church as opposed to the Pope, and this had been established under Henry VIII and kept under Edward, but removed under Mary. So some elements of the Act of Supremacy were predictable. Churchmen had to swear an oath of loyalty to Elizabeth. The heresy laws were repealed. Both communion of both kinds was re-established. So that's about the bread and the wine. Whilst under Catholicism they had just communion of one kind, where the bread would go to the congregation, but only the clergy would have the wine. And it revived the powers of royal visitation of the church. So the state essentially can start checking on what the church is doing. However, some elements were less predictable. Elizabeth had to deal with this quite difficult aspect of could a woman be the head of church, and so she took the title Supreme Governor instead. And the Crown could appoint commissioners to visit, reform and order correct heresies, and they would dictate what these heresies were. And this gave these commissioners a huge amount of power to enforce the settlement that Elizabeth wanted. The reaction to all of this, there was one layman, so one person who wasn't a member of the church, who voted against the Act of Supremacy in the House of Lords. The Marian bishops felt unable to take the oath of supremacy and so lost their jobs. They were deprived of their posts, and there was resistance across the clergy in the country. It is estimated that around 2,000 of parish clergymen lost their positions because they refused to take the oath of supremacy, and that's about a quarter of the clergymen in the parishes across the country, so a very significant number. And so we're seeing all these people going out of their positions, and so Elizabeth is going to have to turn to whatever Protestants she can find to fill as many of these positions as possible. Now, the Act of Uniformity, so this set out the rules about the appearance of the church, there was and the kind of the key actions that take place inside it. So there's a new Book of Common Prayer, which kind of merged the fairly moderate 1549 and more radical 1552 books of common prayer, the Protestant books of prayer that had been brought in by Edward. In the new book, the Black Rubric, which had been given the explanation of why kneeling was okay, was removed. A compromise stance was taken on transubstantiation. So this is the idea that in communion, in Mass, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, and so essentially it was all kind of blurred. So you could, if you wanted to interpret it in a slightly Catholic way, then you could. If you wanted to interpret it in a more Protestant way, then you could. And the insults that have been inserted against the Pope in the 1552 prayer book were all taken out. So it also saw altars being replaced by communion tables. Crosses and candles were allowed on the communion table. Priests were able to wear or are told to wear decorative garments. Attendance at church was compulsory. And there's this famous bit about Elizabeth said she didn't want a window into men's souls. So people essentially, if you didn't go to church, you were fined. And people who didn't go to church were called recusants, and so this is quite different from brutally burning them alive, isn't it? Really, if you were caught going to Catholic Mass again, there were heavy fines. It was a financial attack rather than anything else. Having said that, So for the people who are receiving religious instruction and still going to receive Catholic Mass and things like that, you're being fined. But if you're a Catholic priest who is saying Mass, is leading Mass, then you could face the death penalty. So the reaction to the Act of Uniformity, well, it passed through the House of Commons without incident, but it faced a real struggle in the House of Lords, with the bishops were united in their opposition, and 9 kind of lay or temporal peers joined them, and the Act passed by a very narrow margin, 21 to 18, and this was really only because several Catholic bishops were locked up. And so if all those who could have been there would have been there, then it might well have been defeated. But Elizabeth just locks the people up who were going to make the difference, and so managed to pass it. The final part of the settlement is the royal injunctions, and these changed a number of things. So they set out church regulations, and therefore injunctions were instructions about what should be done. There were 57 to be specific, and they did various things like pilgrimage were outlawed, every church had to display an English Bible, every church had to have a copy of Erasmus paraphrases of the Gospel, which is quite significant because Erasmus we met earlier, didn't we, going all the way back to the reign of Henry VII. So he is a humanist, but essentially he is Catholic, and so we're not seeing a complete break from the old ideas. Priests had to wear a surplice, which was a plain white linen gown, and we've got the other vestments involved in it, and we will see later on other videos I'll do on Elizabeth about the Vesterian controversy. So there is some stuff that is still going to be slightly controversial about all of this. The organisation of the church, well, not everything changed. There was little change in national organisation of the church. There was still an Archbishop of Canterbury, an Archbishop of York. The bishops were to remain in place, also known as the Episcopate, and essentially the Anglican kind of structure of the church is the same as the Catholic structure of the church, without just no cardinals and popes at the top. Continuity was not evident across Protestant churches in Europe. So actually we're almost getting a kind of a separate kind of Anglican Protestantism, an English form of church, different to the more radical kind of Calvinist and Lutheran churches on the continent. So the congregation in those churches itself changed with the new ideas, Calvinism in particular, developing. Bishops was advised to be kept because it would minimise the differences between Catholics and Protestants, and therefore help foreign relations. Elizabeth wanted Marian bishops to stay, but their refusal to swear oath to the Act of Supremacy made it impossible, and therefore they were replaced with Protestant clergy. Cecil had the influence example, and then we've got Grindal, of Bishop of London, Cox in Ely, Julie in Salisbury. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope that's given you everything you need to know about 1559 and the religious settlement. There will be more videos on this, looking at the various problems and resistance from both Catholics and from Protestants. I'd also like to give a huge thank you to Fran, who's helped put this video together, putting together all this wonderful information from one of her absolutely cracking knowledge organisers. So thank you very much for watching. Please remember, as ever, to comment, to like, and if you haven't done so, to subscribe. My Tudor playlist has got videos covering Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth. Thank you very much for watching.